大家好，欢迎收看Ita 看世界，一起看世界。我是 Lano。串联全球的原住民族媒体呢，一直是我们期许的目标。希望持续从各国原住民族的媒体经验相互学习，看见不同观点。而在2022年12月，身为世界原住民族广播电视联盟WITBN的创始会员、澳洲原住民族电视台 NITV 庆祝免费无线频道10周年。而这一路走来相当不容易。而 NITV 是在2007年就创立了，并且在2012年正式成为澳洲公广机构 SBS 旗下的媒体。从这一刻开始，他们直播的内容不再仅限于原住民族人，而是触及全澳洲的民众。为了见证这历史性的里程碑，由5个国家的原住民族电视台组成的世界原住民族广电联盟，包括纽西兰的法卡达毛里、加拿大的 APTN 以及挪威萨米电视台，还有澳洲 NITV 以及我们台湾原民台的代表，都齐聚在澳洲的中心，也是原住民族的圣地乌鲁鲁，献上最大的祝福。而这次的聚会呢，也再度确认了联盟的共识，并拟定未来的策略走向。而今天我们非常荣幸呢，邀请到特别来宾 Tanya Orman， 她是 NITV 相当重要的领导者，也是目前呢 SBS 原住民族节目部的经理，拥有超过20年的媒体经验。他要来跟我们分享 NITV 这10年来的历程，也顺便聊聊今年的澳洲国庆日，原住民族人的诉求到底是什么？而在这当中，原住民族媒体扮演的角色和定位又在哪里？So hi, Tanya. It's so honored to have you here with us today. So first, could you please say hi to our audience and briefly introduce yourself?
Ora wanmada nayukadil Tanya Orman nayu junjun kokayamajan verigaba nayu. I am the Director of Indigenous Content for Special Broadcast Service in Australia, which also includes my remit as the lead for National Indigenous Television, which is a special network within the greater SBS network that we broadcast First Nations content to all of Australians.
So Tanya, you have joined NITV since the very beginning, and you led NITV since it joined SBS in 2012. And you became SBS first Director of Indigenous Content in 2020. So as the important leader, could you briefly introduce NITV to our audience in Taiwan?
National Indigenous Television is a channel made by, for, and about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Through us, it's a channel for all Australians. NITV has been decades in the making. We have just celebrated 10 years of being available to every Australian, but our journey started long before that. We originally switched on as a narrowcaster in 2007, beaming out to bush communities in Australia. We didn't have access into Australian homes. It was a challenge to get the network up and running. We, as First Nations people, had been fighting for a place in Australia's media landscape for many decades. And there was only, we had ABC, SBS had existed, they're public broadcasters, but there was also an incredible ecosystem of remote Indigenous media and Indigenous community radio stations around the country, but we had no national remit or no national platform where we could deliver to all Australians, but particularly to our own communities where they could see themselves in Australian media. So in 2007, we had some funding that could keep us going for a few years, and that got us started, where we started to commission, we started a news and current affairs programming, we started acquiring content from around Australia. There was very few, so we also started creating our own content. We also created, acquired content from over with our brothers and sisters globally as part of the World Indigenous Television Network, including Taiwan. So that helped build NITV. And in 2012, we were able to move and have NITV a part of SBS. And we launched freely to every Australian on the 12th of the 12th in 2012. And that set us up on a new trajectory, stabilising an Indigenous platform for all Australians, but importantly, for the 300 odd different nations of First Nations peoples that we have in Australia. We've got distinct Aboriginal group and Torres Strait Islanders, but within that, we have about 300 different nations and clans that are First Nations who've been a part of this continent for more than 65,000 years.
So since 2012, NITV has officially become a media channel under SBS network. So could you tell us more about the positioning of NITV under the SBS network?
And we, so technically, legally, we became a division of SBS. However, with our First Nations communities and advisory groups within the move of NITV into the network, we ensured that we adjusted the editorial guidelines and the code. So we have a really distinct positioning within the network to deliver this unique proposition, because everything at NITV is First Nations created. So what you see on screen is as important what's behind the scenes. So we're about growing the sector as well. So, and we work with the production sector. So that was a different modelling to what SBS had done in the past. So we moved the whole team. There's about 60 people that make up the channel, and then they work with production companies all over Australia. But we're a distinct network within the network. Technically, it is a division of SBS. So we're a part of our board, and our governance is with the SBS board, which includes First Nation membership. And there's also a community advisory that includes First Nation membership. However, in all intents and purposes, we are administered under the SBS Act now. And so we have a distinct place within the positioning. However, we are technically part of the SBS. So it's not a collaboration in any sense of the words. We are a part of SBS, but we deliver a distinct service for First Nations people through NITV. And we also deliver Indigenous content across the multi-platform universe of SBS. So we deliver Indigenous content onto the main channel, onto the food channel. We also, as part of SBS, which is the multicultural channel for Australia, we deliver our Indigenous content out into 60 odd different world languages, from Arabic, Mandarin, Cantonese. So new Australians or visitors who are coming into Australia can also get Indigenous news and current affairs or programming in our perspectives in the languages that they know and they trust. So we're in a really unique position as part of the network.
Among the mainstream media, how does NITV use the media power to promote and preserve Indigenous languages? And what is the Indigenous language percentage of the channel?
We're on a, with the impacts of colonisation onto Australia, where we have some First Nation groups, where English is their sixth language and they speak different First Nation languages, but we also have new languages or, language revitalisation happening. So we're also reflecting that within the channel. So when asked what's the percentage, it's more the fact that when you watch NITV on any given day, you will hear First Nation languages. So we have an always-on strategy, whether it's it's more bilingual or it's incorporated or you see it. There are probably less programs that we will have that are completely in language, but we do have, say, I know about 20% of our content are in different languages. The challenge is, of course, because we are, about 300 different nations. So how we also make that work and have the resources to subtitle and have those. So We do deliver our children's program. For instance, we've got a beautiful show called Little Jane Because, that's now in its 4th season, and that's also delivered in 25 different First Nations languages, and that's available on our on-demand service called SBS On Demand. So the percentage is a good question and one where I can have a look at. However, you know, I guess for you know, the aim is to keep on growing, keep on improving, and in reflection of the decade of the world's Indigenous languages, it's really important for us to reflect the movement that's happening, considering schools, hospitals, institutions in Australia shut out all our languages. Once upon a time, you would be locked up if you were speaking First Nations language. So Australia is transitioning. So we're wanting to reflect that and ensure that our network is a safe space, a fun space, and not just First Nation communities are connecting and seeing themselves represented and hearing their languages, but also more and more Australians are hearing and connecting to these languages too.
Last December, NITV celebrates 10 years free-to-air anniversary at the heart of the Australia, Uluru. And as the member of WITBN, we are also very honored to be invited to there and celebrate together. So Tanya, could you share with us about the celebration at that time?
Yeah, NITV was absolutely thrilled to be invited back to Central of Australia, out to Uluru, and the community that's near it, Mototjulu, to celebrate the decade on since we became available to every Australian. So the reason we launched originally at Uluru 10 years ago and became available to every Australian there is for, I guess, 2 key reasons. Our media industry really spawned and through Central Australia media practitioners. So we wanted to pay homage to the many decades that existed before NITV existed and those shoulders who we stood on to get there. So the media sector, the remote media sector particularly, and those that fought hard for languages to be heard when we were, you know, not seen or visible. And if we were seen or visible in Australian TV, most likely we were portrayed in a very negative sense. So that started really in Central Australia. So, and then Uluru is spiritually connected for First Nations people. We have many song lines that have crosses into Uluru, creation stories that go into that for all the different nations around Australia. And then also Australians in general have a connection to this place because it is, you know, for those who have gone there can understand it is, there is a incredible pull. It's a very ancient land. It's a very special place. So we launched as the media, you know, we're the world's oldest continuous storytellers. Our stories still exist strongly today. And we wanted to go to the Central Australia, into Uluru again, and to be invited and work with the community to celebrate this important moment was incredible. So we launched initially 10 years ago, being available to every Australian, and then really the only place that we could celebrate this 10-year milestone had to be Uluru. The actual event, we invited our industry to come. We wanted to, everyone who's been a part of NITV's story, NITV success, to converge onto Uluru. So we had our state agencies, our screen practitioners, we had the best of Australian and who happen to be First Nations performers, artists, and we wanted to really deliver something special for all our Australian audiences, and we were really you know, proud that our global partners, our World Indigenous partners, also took the content so that they could sort of reverberate, because a part of our story has been connecting with other World Indigenous brothers and sisters and sharing our stories and learning from each other as well.
As you mentioned, everything started from Uluru, and this place is also a sacred place for the Indigenous peoples in Australia. And you also mentioned about the song lines. So could you share with us what is the concept of the song lines and why it is so important for Indigenous peoples?
Songlines are, stories that you get passed on and help you, navigate through the land to know where to go or what story. So it's how you learn law and customs. So you get passed on your story. And when you have songlines that connect, it's about, okay, how the land was made and where there's, men's business, women's business, you can't go there. So you get past these stories and the song tells you where you can go. The song looks after you. The song is something you pass on. It's a science. So different clans have different songs, where they belong. So it's the lore, I guess. It's a way that you sort of know, your story and your place. So I don't know if you remember when I played I'm learning my song. So that song tells about where is my traditional country, where I can go, where I don't go, which might be dangerous. So that song has been passed on from clan to from my families over the generations, and you get taught it when you're young. To teach you that's your area, that's where you can go, or you may get songs when you come into initiation phase and when you're doing men's business. So when we went around to Uluru and they said that's for men, we're not going there for the women. So yeah, songs are about, in generally, yeah, you get sung it, and that's how you learn it.
So 10 years is a long journey. From your observation, what are the changes and growth of NITV in the past 10 years? And what does it mean for Australian Indigenous peoples?
This last decade, we'd won the massive awards for film, media, television, journalism. We had to really prove ourselves that we could exist, not just for First Nations people, but for all Australians. So in this last 10 years, we had a lot to celebrate. And, we've grown media careers for our communities as well. And if you look at Australian television and media, it's very different to what it was 10 years ago. And I think NITV has played a special part of shifting the narrative. Now you've got a new generation of young Australians, but particularly our communities, seeing themselves on television in a way previous generations never got to see, or seeing themselves on digital platforms in a way, and empowered in that energy. And that's really shifting the narrative in Australia, but it's also shifting for justice and rights, and we have a voice in a way that we've never had. So we needed to really make a point. Uluru is at the heart of Australia, and so are we. So it was really important to have this incredible celebration. The environment was intense, and then rainbows came out for us. It was really special. We had to have our World Indigenous brothers and sisters there to also sing country, but to have the lawmen and women of that country also call us, welcome us, and make sure we were looked after. And just, their one advice was just keep positivity, the love, the energy. And that's what we do as a sector and a network. We keep creative and we use that energy. So the Uluru, we had a concert that went for 3 hours live across Australia. We celebrated with news programming. We reflected on the history. We thanked people for being a part of it, and we looked forward to an incredible future. And we shook up the dirt. We pulled country. We celebrated our cultures, and we really wanted to make sure we gave that gift to Australians who, and as I say, our communities who are our number one audience, and say thank you for being with us on this journey.
Welcome 欢迎回到节目现场。上个阶段，我们谈到澳洲原住民族电视台 NITV 庆祝免费无线频道10周年，看到他们的转变以及在主流媒体中清楚的定位。 那接下来我们要继续来问问谭雅，原住民族媒体在澳洲社会扮演的角色。我们就从每一年的开始，也就是1月26号的国庆日来看。So Tanya, January 26th is the National Day of Australia. So could you please briefly introduce the origin of National Day and how Australians think about this day, because it also represents the Invention Day and Survival Day for the Indigenous peoples?
January 26th is an abrupt way, an emotional way, a very mixed way to start the year. It represents many things to many Australians. To many, it is the official day that you celebrate the nation. It's been since 1994 the official day of celebration of Australia. However, on January 26th is also the day that marks the arrival of British colonisation into this country. So for many First Nations people, it actually marks the day of invasion. It also then represents a day of mourning, because that was the beginning of the end for our ways that were before they came. And, you know, I guess in a sense of hope, it can also be considered for many of our communities, because we've got to push forward a day of survival, that in fact we weren't wiped out as they had planned, that we are here staunch, and we always will be here. So we always was and always will be. So then how you mark that day has very many mixed feelings for our communities. And particularly in recent years, it means very mixed feelings for many Australians now. So there is a discussion that happens in Australia every year in the lead up to it is, number one, why have a national day of celebration on a day that marks invasion? I think Australia may be one of the only countries, if the only country that has its national day where one group oppresses the other. And there are a lot of more and more Australians who are concerned about that as well, like why have that day? But there are many Australians that say, look, that was the past, it's not now. And, you know, it was a part of our history, but here's a great day to actually celebrate. So it creates a lot of anxiety, a lot of, you know, but also depending on how you take this moment, for some it's also a day of empowerment, where many of our communities hit the streets to remind Australians of the injustices that still exist, and that in fact Australia is not a place that's fair, and that it has provided a safe place for everybody, and there are still inconsistencies and injustices that still need to be dealt with. So for many First Nations, and I know within our media sector, we utilise this day while Australians are talking about national identity. This is a great time where we get elevated, actually, where we actually have many media outlets asking our thoughts and opinions, because our community does hit the streets. And, you know, we always have, and as I mentioned, it's also seen as a day of mourning. Before it was officially Australia Day, we were always hitting the streets on that day because it was that day. So there was always, you know, the movement of First Nations rights in this country, of inclusion, or to have access into the same freedoms that other Australians have. We've always hit the streets on this day. So it wasn't just in the last 30 years that, you know, First Nations people hit the streets. We've always made a point on this day, and we always will be. So whether it's Australia Day or not.
So from my point of view, there are still many different voices on this day, which is why Indigenous media plays an important role. I'd like to ask, what does NITV do on this day to provoke the conversation in society?
So as the Indigenous channel, you know, the channel that's for First Nations peoples in this country, it's always been really important for us to reflect our communities and our diversities of views, considering Australia is such a huge country. It was colonised in different ways, and for many years, it was like very much a New South Wales sort of focus day, which is where the landings were. So we're keen, we've always reflected. Some communities have concerts put on so that mob have a place to come and be, because there is an overwhelming sense of the majority within the community. So as a media outlet, I actually feel really empowered that we get to reflect and we get to talk and we get to amplify our issues. And that's why, as a network, we do a season leading into the day called Always Was, Always Will Be. Because if you go to any rallies around Australia with our communities, that's the chant you'll hear. You'll always hear always was, always will be Aboriginal land, because of the policies that Australia had implemented and the wars to try and annihilate, assimilate First Nations peoples into the community. So we do a season called Always Was, Always Will Be, where we elevate truth-telling stories, so the best of our documentaries, the best of our movies. And then this year, on the eve of Australia Day, on the eve of January 26, we have a program called the Sunset Ceremony, so the show that represents the last sunset before they came and our world changed forever. So we delivered a 2-hour program that we broadcast live across Australia, and we did it from, the backdrop was Sydney Harbour Bridge, the Opera House, a very iconic positioning that many people all over the globe know and straight away see that as Sydney. So we took over the point there, and that point, of course, is a beautiful meeting place and always has been for First Nations people, the Gadigal people, the Gadigal clan of that area. And we delivered 2 hours of conversation, art, theatre, provoking discussion and understanding about why this date is so complex. And we also ensured, we could set up the agenda for the year, because of course Australians are about to vote in a referendum to have Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people included in the Australian Constitution, or have a voice to Parliament. So there's the referendum for a voice to Parliament. So what does that mean when our population is about 3% of Australia's population? So the majority of Australians, many of whom have not met an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander person, I'd say 6 out of 10 Australians have not met one, or maybe they don't care to, and racial issues are still on the rise in this country. So cohesion is still an issue in this country. So we had a lot where, we wanted to provide really thoughtful discussion that could cut through to wider Australian audiences. We had guests from other parts of Australian society, from multicultural guests, we had refugees, we had other people represented on the panels. We had, journalists talking about, what is the future for this country? What does symbolism mean? What does it mean to be an Australian? What does our identity mean? And why does it all matter? So it's a really important way for us to take courage of the narrative, empower our communities, that we can, utilise media for its utmost. And this is the reason we exist. And we also have in our schedule, some slow TV. We have some landscape, because it can be such a hectic, noisy start of the year. So we're mindful that for some of our communities who are dealing with all degrees of different trauma, maybe they want their Indigenous media to sort of be a bit more chilled, so we try to offer that. And also we have many success stories. We have many young scientists, and, we have, First Nations people who are, Young Australians of the Year, and they're delivering and making this continent, this nation called Australia, a better nation. And we're in Canberra, we're in Parliament, so that it's a really interesting mix. We want to acknowledge our history and our truth that yet many Australians are yet to really understand. We need to ensure that Australia knows there's still injustices, and we need to correct the wrongs. And it is really important that you need to acknowledge the past, you need to heal from it. And we also need to acknowledge that in this whole 250 odd year history, we've been contributing and we've been helping this land become the nation it is today as well. So how is that recognized and how is that narrative being looked at? And it's really important because I think at the end of the day, as individuals, as humans, as people, there's a degree of needing a sense of belonging. And as spiritual people, our country and our place is really important. How you fit in that place, that ecosystem, and how you contribute to it and how you look after it is really important. So that's why these days like the National Day and how we all work together are really important. And that's the power of our media. And, you know, we take that with all the responsibility that we know, because if it wasn't for our ancestors and those that have gone before us, we wouldn't exist. And there's a reason why we have this media and why we're so passionate here at NITV about it.
So for the Australia Day, NITV provide a more comprehensive perspectives to the audience in Australia through the special programs and forums. We would like to know whether there have been specific changes in Australian society.
There's definitely, look, judging by media, judging by, you know, various conversations that you hear, there's definitely a shift of understanding and consideration. There's definitely debate that does happen across social media about whether it's really an appropriate date to be celebrating the country. There's also discussion, do you need a date? Do you need to have a national day? There's, you know, so it ranges from abolish the date to conversations about let's move it to a date that makes sense for everybody. And doesn't, you know, and then you have some that say, look, at least this date we elevate the issues and, you know, maybe the day needs to change slightly in the way it's looked at. So there is definitely a lot of change and discussion that's happening. Keeping in mind it's been Australia Day since 1994, and there was a lot of investment into schools, into systems about this idea of Australianism and ideology about what it is to be an Australian. And at that stage in 1994, it was about the blonde, blue-eyed surfing, throwing a shrimp on the Barbie sort of combos that was happening in Australian media and how it launched as well. So there's, you know, discussions about is this actually, and of course the campaigns have adjusted over the years, where many, there's more inclusion, there's celebration of the diversity of Australia. However, you know, as I mentioned, First Nations people have been hitting the streets about this day since it was long before it was Australia Day. So it's always been a day that we rise and we remember as a day of mourning. It's always been a day we remember, particularly in this region, in the New South Wales area, the Eora Nations, as a day when they first came and the shift happened. So, and for many Australians, it's been discussed in schools where it before, you know, and we didn't have NITV in the past, so you didn't have media, didn't have social media. So you had, you know, media, television networks, radio stations could, you know, feeds or didn't allow the conversation to occur. So it's really interesting to see the shift. And, you know, the rallying, there's been shifts in organisations and local councils who no longer celebrate or do citizenship ceremonies on Australia Day. You've got the network, Channel 10 this year, where they don't call it Australia Day, they don't acknowledge it in that way. So you have institutions, you've got a major, you know, shopping outlet, Kmart, in Australia that refused to, you know, pulled its sort of paraphernalia, the Australian flag and what that provokes in communities. So you're having institution shifts, you're having discussions in media in a different way that never occurred before. You've actually got local councils changing the way they do the day as well. So it's a really, you know, what's really special as this sort of free democratic country in that sense, the fact that we can do this sort of discussion, debate, without any major fear. However, it still does create and generate a lot of intensity for particularly First Nations communities, because in actual fact there's not been, the business hasn't been resolved, and there needs to be a lot of corrections and whether there ever will be enough to have to be done. But I think the main thing really that you're hearing is understanding history, understanding why, and we call that truth telling in Australia. And until that fully is explored, and what does that look like? That looks like how schools are teaching First Nations or their history, how they're teaching about the Australian wars, you know, the frontier wars that actually happened. All that narrative was not included in the school curricula. So that is still yet to, you know, some schools do more now, but it's not blanket, you know, a blanket sort of teachings yet. So we still have a long way to go, but a long way to answer your question. There is a discussion, there is a definite shift in the air about, is this the right thing to do, and what is the right thing to do?
In fact, the indigenous people have different demands on every national day. Especially in the second half of this year, there's a referendum about indigenous voice to Parliament. From the perspective of the media, what do you think of these demands and what indigenous peoples really want to achieve?
Australia is made up of 300 odd different First Nations, and we've been colonised in different ways or impacted through wars, as in the frontier wars, had removals and policies inflicted on different groups. So there are, you know, we're not one homogenous group, and we have different ways of thinking what is the, you know, appropriate way for our communities. And that's also reflected into, you know, questions of, should there be a voice into Parliament, into the way that Australia currently legislates, you know, every citizen. And then you have discussions over, well, we're sovereign people, and then you'll have discussions, well, that's not ceding sovereignty. You know, we never ceded sovereignty, and what happens in Canberra is not a reflection of the sovereignty. What it is a systematic change into way First Nations policies and funding is looked at. So, of course, there is debate, and there's also concern about whether there should be treaty before a voice. And then what does treaty look like? Because, of course, there's treaties are rolling out across different state jurisdictions in Australia. So you have, you know, the state system, because we have, you know, the federal government tier, you also have your state government, and then you also have your local council government as well in Australia. So treaties are happening, as I mentioned earlier. Local councils are doing different things around Australia. So discussions amongst our communities, you know, there's no surprises. Trust is a massive issue, because we have in the past gone 5 steps forward, 3 steps back, or we've achieved, you know, only in 1992 did the High Court actually acknowledge that Australia actually wasn't vacant land. So we had the Mabo decision in 1992, and then the powerful Whig people from far north Queensland pushed forward a Whig decision that changed the way native title existed on the mainland of Australia. That was a massive step forward, but there was a lot of fear-mongering in media back in the mid-90s that we were stealing backyards, and it was a very ironic campaign, but it took race relations back many years. So we you know, once upon a time we wanted land rights, and we get land rights, but then how legislation mucks around with it, and we, you know, there's wins, but there's also disputes that happen. So when we've worked and we've won, there's always been compromise and adjustments, and it's been depending on who gets into power, how that changes and how that impacts our community. So there's a lot of trust and concern about any sort of progress or any sort of attempt of change. So clarity, communication, consultation, and, you know, genuine consultation are major issues. So whether it is treaty, whether it is referendum and rights, it's how voices are heard and a part of the discussion. So, you know, it's going to be an interesting year in front of us. I'm really glad that we're 10 years on as a free-to-air channel as NITV. I'm really really excited that we do have an Indigenous network, in the sense that we can do everything in our power to ensure we've got trusted, informed, factual information out there. Because in the midst of First Nations discussions over the best way forward, you do still have a lot of Australians who, maybe don't care about First Nations people, or who are blatantly racist against First Nations people. So we have these different microcosms going on as a nation in this year, and that's why media plays a critical role in the year ahead, and it has a very responsible role to get it right in the year ahead.
As we know, WITBN has been established for 14 years now, and NITV is a founding member. What is your prospect for the future of WITBN?
I've been a part of NITV since the very beginning, since we first switched on in 2007. And then a year later, NITV was part of the formation of the World Indigenous Television Broadcast Network, WITBN, and I've had the privilege of being a part of that journey. And as a young practitioner, I was a commissioner of journalists, to be exposed at the global level to see how other Indigenous channels or networks were working, and also what was happening in their community. So straight away from the very beginning for WITBN, it was about sharing content, sharing ideas, and supporting each other in however way we could, with whatever might we could. So that still exists today. We've got our own challenges in our own backyards, but there's a lot that can be achieved with connection. And, if there's one thing the last couple of years have given us, if there is a positivity that has come out of the COVID era, has been this quick adjustment to video conferencing and team connections. And in a way, the globe has gotten quite smaller. It's a lot quicker and easier to have these international meetings. So in a way, our World Alliance has had an opportunity to realign and reshift, because prior to that, we had so many challenges because we had to sort of fight for our own existence, because we're all dealing with, digital transitions and government adjustments and, television, what is that in the modern era? So we, as our different First Nation partners in our own countries, have had to be quick, evolving, revolving entities. And there's one thing for sure, as First Nations peoples in our countries, we have an agility and a resilience like no other. So we've evolved and adjusted. So it's incredible to be reconnecting as a global network, and a strengthened approach with a new generation who are quick and see the vision in a way that maybe those previously didn't have the opportunity to see, because we're more exposed in digital and social media in a way that we weren't back in 2008. So the future is really quite exciting. Not only are we talking about this, content sharing, distribution, how we can learn from each other through languages, but this idea of connecting and being a global network can play to all of our advantages, as I guess audiences for all of us, and not just within our local area. There's global interest in First Nations knowledges in a way that never existed before. Climate crisis, climate challenges, how we are looking at those who've survived the longest on this planet and their science, and how does that actually resonate with more and more global citizens. So we have something to provide, and it's really lovely to have a network that only wants to share and connect. We're here we're beyond, it's not about the commercialization. This is about our planet and how we provide nourishment for our children with great storytelling, provide entertainment and connection, so that we as spirits together can deliver something pretty special. So it's really exciting to learn from each other, to connect, and to be real players in this ever-exploding media planet that we're all a part of. So that's what I'm excited about for the future of the WITBN and what has always been the vision really from the very beginning. We just didn't know it then.
Last but not least, in Taiwan and Australia, and even the indigenous peoples in other countries, we all going through the process of transitional justice. Is there anything you want to share with us?
Yeah, for the communities, the First Nations peoples of Taiwan particularly, is to have strength with each other, support each other, and connect and communicate as much as possible. And I think that's the power of having your own media network. There's going to be, 4 steps forward, 2 steps back. There's always going to be challenges. But if there's one thing I've experienced or been a part of when it comes to media or First Nations growth within my own country, is being consistent and having that agility, but also that resilience and never giving up. So there is a world of support for you, and that's something to always keep hold of. And I think, as First Nations peoples, we're connected in ways that we, I don't think we all realise how connected we are sometimes, and how much we can learn from each other and how much we can support each other as well. So there are challenging times, but there's also lots of positive achievements that when you look back and see how far we've actually come, despite the challenges, imagine, the future really is for us to take hold of with both hands. So I would, if there's one sort of lasting sort of wish, a word is, we're here and we support each other and never give up.
So never give up, and always remember that we supporting each other on the process of transitional justice. So Tanya, thank you so much for the sharing with us today. 那刚才呢，谭雅有提到呢，原住民族媒体具备的弹性和适应力，能在快速变化的媒体产业中不断重新的定位和转换，确保呢有一个稳定的平台，持续的传递原住民族的声音。今天非常感谢观众的收看，祝您平安，再会。